Slavery was never just about labor. It was about control, humiliation, and filthy lies buried under plantations and parlor rooms. Behind the polished images of noble masters and delicate mistresses lived a hidden world of disturbing realities. Unspeakable acts carried out in the shadows. Acts so cruel they still break the heart centuries later. Picture it, footsteps echoing on polished wooden floors, laughter drifting from glittering ballrooms, while just beyond the doors, chains drag across stone. Whispers in the night cut suddenly by silence. This was the dual face of slavery. Polished civility outside, a filthy underworld of cruelty inside. And so we ask, what was the filthy side of slavery that white men and women never wanted the world to see? The time is the 1700s and 1800s. Across the American South, the Caribbean, and colonial outposts, slavery shaped society. White men stood as lords of wealth, proclaiming themselves masters of order and morality. White women were painted as guardians of reputation, delicate ornaments of virtue. And black men and women? They were reduced to voiceless property, stripped of choice before they could even speak their own names. Plantations presented themselves as empires of refinement. White columns gleamed under the sun. Elegant ballrooms held dances where manners were paraded like jewels. Ministers praised the masters as paragons of Christian virtue, but step into the slave quarters or follow the back stairways, and another world revealed itself. A world where refinement was a mask and cruelty was the unspoken law. Imagine living in a place where your body, your voice, and your future were stolen before you were even born. Imagine knowing that you were entered into ledgers like livestock, your name scribbled in ink next to cattle and tools, your fate dictated by the whims of another human being who claimed ownership not only over your work, but over your breath, your blood, your womb, your very existence. This was slavery, and this was only the beginning of its dirtiest secrets. Enslaved men and women were not people in the eyes of the law. They were items of property, commodities that could be bought, sold, traded, and inherited. Masters controlled everything. The food a person ate, the rags they wore, the marriages they attempted, even the children they bore. Total control meant that no part of life was truly theirs. Even reproduction became property of the master, used to increase his wealth. Surveillance and silencing were constant. Enslaved people were monitored from sunrise to nightfall, their movements restricted, their privacy annihilated. Black men were systematically emasculated, denied authority, often targeted for brutal punishments meant to destroy not only their bodies, but their sense of manhood. Black women endured both the lash of field labor and the hidden, nastier torments behind the walls of their masters' homes. And here lies the truth that polite society never wanted told, because what happened behind the walls of those houses was far filthier than anything recorded in official history. White masters turned bedrooms into prisons. Many enslaved women were forced into their chambers, stripped not only of clothing, but of choice, of dignity, of humanity itself. It was not desire that drove these acts. It was power, a disturbing need to dominate completely. Unspeakable coercion, repeated night after night, became part of the system itself. White mistresses, often portrayed as innocent victims of patriarchy, were not always passive. Their jealousy burned like fire, and many directed it not at their husbands, but at the women enslaved in their households. They lashed out with cruelty, whipping women, branding them as temptresses, punishing them for sins they never chose. To the world, these mistresses were symbols of virtue. Behind closed doors, they were sometimes the architects of filthy punishments. And it was not only women who suffered. Some enslaved men, too, were drawn into the machinery of humiliation. Masters and mistresses alike used them as tools of dominance. Some were forced into degrading acts, treated not as men but as symbols to be broken, their strength twisted into another form of bondage. To resist meant death. To submit meant living with unspeakable shame. Secret rooms and back stairways became part of the architecture of exploitation. Women summoned at night through hidden passages, their absence unnoticed or deliberately ignored. By morning, they returned to fields and kitchens as if nothing had happened, invisible in daylight, haunted in silence. The lies that concealed it all were even filthier than the acts themselves. Children born of rape were denied by masters, blamed on the supposed promiscuity of enslaved women. These children, blood of their blood, were enslaved alongside their mothers, denied love, denied names, denied truth. Generations enslaved by their own fathers, as if the cycle of cruelty could be hidden under polite smiles and Christian hymns. And this was no isolated story. This was a system, a design, a network of abuse carefully buried beneath the facade of civility. But what did this system do to its victims? How did it scar them? How did it break them? And how, against all odds, did they endure? The impact on the victims was relentless, written into flesh and memory. Enslaved women carried bodies torn from endless pregnancies, their wombs turned into battlegrounds for their masters' desires and their owners' greed. Some gave birth in fields, collapsing in the dirt only to rise and be ordered back to work. Malnutrition weakened them, beatings scarred them, untreated diseases consumed them. Yet even more devastating than the physical pain was the weight of the emotional chains. Imagine raising a child you knew you could never protect, a son who might be sold before his first steps, a daughter who might be taken into another master's house, condemned to repeat the same unspeakable cycle. Mothers wept silently in the dark, hiding their grief because even tears could bring punishment. Fathers stood powerless, watching wives and daughters violated by men who owned them, their own manhood ripped away not just by chains, but by humiliation. The family unit, the foundation of survival, was shattered deliberately. Masters orchestrated separations, selling children like livestock, tearing apart husbands and wives, scattering families across counties, states, even nations. Love was treated as rebellion. Marriage was forbidden. Choice was mocked. Every stolen bond was another layer of control. Yet still, within this nightmare, threads of resilience appeared. Enslaved women whispered survival strategies to one another, holding secret support networks in cabins lit by candle stubs. They taught their children songs with hidden meanings, lullabies that carried both sorrow and warning. They prayed in silence, turning faith into a quiet rebellion, believing that even if the world denied their humanity, their souls remained untouchable. It was resilience born not of freedom, but of necessity. And so the question arises, how do we know these disturbing realities, if so many were buried in silence? For centuries, the evidence hid in whispers. Slave narratives became the first voices to pierce through the lies. Harriet Jacobs, in her book Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, risked everything to expose what others refused to acknowledge. She wrote of the relentless pursuit by her master, of the way her body was treated as a possession, of the agony of protecting her children from the same fate. Her words were not just testimony, they were a crack in the walls of denial. Travelers' accounts sometimes echoed the truths. Outsiders passing through plantations noted hypocrisies too filthy to ignore. Letters and diaries left behind by white women revealed both their jealousy and their awareness. Some wrote bitterly of their husbands' shameful practices, while others hinted at the cruel punishments they themselves inflicted upon enslaved women. Even in these fragments, the facade of civility crumbled, but the law remained silent. In courts, enslaved women were property. To accuse a master was to accuse an owner of misusing his own possession. Rape was not recognized. Consent was meaningless. Legal silence amplified social denial, and so the suffering remained unspoken in official records. Only now, through modern revelations, do we confront what was long hidden. DNA studies reveal tangled family lines, linking African American descendants to white plantation owners whose names once gleamed in history books. Every strand of DNA tells a story that polite society tried to erase. Every discovery is a reminder that the evidence was always there, buried, silenced, but never gone. And how has society reacted? For centuries, with denial. Whitewashing of history transformed slavery into a narrative of labor and economics, erasing the filthier truths of sexual exploitation. Textbooks told children about cotton, about sugar, about rice, but rarely about broken bodies, stolen wombs, or nights spent in secret rooms of shame. Within Black communities, however, memory endured. Oral traditions carried the weight of pain. Families passed down stories in whispers, not always with details, but with warnings. Be careful. Don't trust their kindness. These stories were not only history, they were survival tools. Historians themselves struggled with the topic. For decades, even scholars avoided addressing the disturbing realities of sexual abuse and slavery. Some called it delicate. Others labeled it taboo. This reluctance was another silence, another erasure layered atop centuries of denial. The victims were buried twice, first in chains, then in history books. Only in recent years has there been a reckoning. Documentaries, books, and museum exhibits now confront the nastier truths. Plantation tours once centered on architecture now face demands to include the stories of the enslaved. Communities have pushed for honesty, for the filth behind the facade to finally be revealed. The ghosts of history are forcing themselves into the present, demanding acknowledgement. But one haunting question remains. Why? Why did white men and women create and protect such a filthy system of abuse? Some argue it was about power, the need to dominate not only through labor, but through flesh, turning the human body into the ultimate arena of control. Others point to obsession, the twisted fascination with black bodies, fueled by racist myths that painted them as exotic, hypersexual, available for exploitation. For some mistresses, it was jealousy transformed into cruelty. For masters, it was lust fused with domination. For both, it was impunity, a system that assured them they could act without consequence. Religion was twisted into justification. Ministers preached obedience, quoting scripture to demand that enslaved people submit, while ignoring the disturbing hypocrisy that their congregants returned home to lives of abuse. Children of masters grew up with filthy lies whispered into their ears. Lies that painted their fathers as noble, their mothers as innocent, and the enslaved as guilty of sins they never committed. A cycle of denial passed down like inheritance, and so centuries later, we are left with a scar carved into the bodies of men and women who endured unspeakable acts. A scar that history tried to bleach clean, but which still bleeds when spoken aloud. Picture it now: silent fields, broken cabins, chains echoing in the wind, the laughter of children sold away, the cries of mothers muffled in the dark, the cold gaze of white mistresses, the predatory hands of white masters. The filthy side of slavery was never hidden too. Those who endured it, it was their daily reality, their endless night. The closing truth is this: these stories break the heart not because they were rare, but because they were common, because every plantation held its own secrets, its own hidden chambers, its own graveyard of lies. To remember the victims is to shatter the silence. To ignore them is to let the disturbing realities of slavery remain hidden in the shadows. Now that we know, now that the walls of history finally speak, one question remains. Will we look away, or will we finally face the dirt that history tried so desperately to wash clean?